to today's Healthy Relationships Initiative program on healing relationships, reflecting after a contentious election season. And my name's Christy Murray, and I am the director of the Center for Youth, Family, and Community Partnerships at UNC Greensboro, where I also oversee the Healthy Relationships Initiative. We're glad you're here with us today. Today's program is actually sort of a part two. We had all of this panel of experts plus one additional one with us back for a conversation pre-election. And at the time, we thought it would be helpful, and it sort of was confirmed as we've kind of seen all the different events play out over the past couple months and the impact that that's had on relationships of all kinds, that we wanted to go ahead and bring back together this panel for sort of a post-election discussion on healing relationships after we've gotten through such a contentious and stressful election season. So in just a moment, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and just share a little bit of their background. All of our panelists are faculty at UNC Greensboro, and which is where the Healthy Relationships Initiative is housed. We do invite you to connect with our other Healthy Relationships Initiative resources through our website at healthyrelationshipsinitiative.org, as well as through social media at Healthy Relationships Initiative on Facebook and Instagram for more resources and programs that promote happy, healthy, and safe relationships of all kinds. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and just share a little bit about their professional background and the unique lens that they bring to this discussion. So let's just go through it in the order that we have you pictured here on the screen. So Jeff, thanks for being back with us for today's conversation. Could you give yourself a little bit of an introduction?
Sure. My name is Jeff Colbert. I'm a faculty member in the political science department at UNCG, technically a senior lecturer. Beginning my 34th year teaching at UNCG. I focus on American policy, so that's typically where my classes and so forth comes from. Native North Carolinian and also a proud alumnus of UNC Greensboro as well. So I'm pretty rooted to this community, and I've been in the Greensboro area for, oh, gracious, probably the last 40 years, something like that, 45 years. So pleased to be here and glad to be able to share and converse with my colleagues.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that great introduction, and we're glad to have you back for this discussion. Jason, how about you're next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Herndon. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I'm the director here at UNCG of the UNCG Psychology Clinic, which is a graduate training clinic affiliated with the psychology program. My background is I am largely a child and family therapist. And so in my clinical work, that's the type of thing that I do. And then I also spend most of my day running this clinic and then training the students who are getting their doctoral degree in clinical psychology to be psychologists.
All right, great. We really appreciate that mental health and family and relationship perspective that you'll bring to today's discussion, Jason. And Jeremy, that leaves you. So welcome and thank you for being here today. And could you go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
Sure, yeah, thanks. And I'm happy to be here again. My name is Jeremy Renker. I am a faculty member in Peace and Conflict Studies at UNCG, where I teach both undergraduate and graduate students. In our field, looking at, and so my background is in conflict analysis and resolution, and looking at how conflict, what the sources of conflict are, how it escalates, what the dynamics are, what the outcomes of conflict can be. So I'm happy to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
All right. Thank you, Jeremy. And thanks again to all of you. I can't wait to dive into our conversation. And really one of the things that I think made our first discussion so fascinating and helpful to me was really the interdisciplinary perspective. So each of you come from a very different professional discipline, and yet all of you have a really unique and helpful lens to offer. So to get us started, I wanted to share the first question. And this one is just open, and whoever wants to jump in first can take it on. So the 2020 election is over, but the impact that this election season has had on relationships of all kinds is definitely not over. So can each of you speak a little bit about how relationships of all kinds have been impacted by the contentious relationships and the contentious elections, this past year?
Sure. Well, I'll start from the political end of the perspective, and then we all sort of get in together. This election was a very unusual election in that there was at least a lot of conversation about whether or not the election was legitimate. Typically, there's an election, we're done, and then the next 2 months discussion is about how one person is leaving, how the next person's coming in. And then we have this big party on January 20th, essentially, and have a really peaceful transition. And obviously, with the events of January 6th, with the conversation prior to that, this has just not been a typical election transition process. And I think that has heightened emotions and has heightened disagreements between people from a political perspective, personal perspective, all kinds of different dimensions.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, following up on that, maybe even thinking about, I don't know how many people had the chance to watch the kind of what would have been the inaugural balls, but because of COVID, of course, everything was changed. I thought the production of that event was really done very professionally. You had Tom Hanks, as the kind of MC, and all these different stars and singers and things coming out. And I thought the framing of that was done really nice, and that this kind of push towards unity, I think, is important in this time. As Jeff said, a very difficult kind of transition even before the elections, but then after as well. I mean, I think the other thing that came to my mind is just from my own experience as an academic. I think we live in a culture that's kind of anti-intellectual, and maybe the internet has added more to that. And so I think oftentimes, when we speak about our own feelings or our own perspectives on what happens, we as academics, there's oftentimes a pushback of kind of like, oh, we don't want to hear from you. I feel that at times. And so that's impacted some of my own family relationships and friend and neighbor relationships at times. Yeah. So that's the kind of, when I heard the question at first, that's what came first to mind, is just my own visceral reaction to kind of, and frustration probably with, why can't we sit and dialogue about this? Why can't we have, intellectual conversations about what's happening in our country?
Mm-hmm. I think that Jeff's point is really a good one. And I was sort of thinking the same thing, that something that stands out to me about this election, and particularly its impact on relationships, right, is relationship conflict around politics is not brand new, so within families, within coworkers, right, within couples, people have been having these conversations, sometimes heated, for a number of years. I think that what feels different this time is that there is generally the sense of a lead up to an election, maybe a little bit of a petering out, whether your person won or didn't win. And then the conversation begins to shift. And I think even now, right, as of this moment, we're not seeing the conversation shift in that same way, right? And so I think perhaps if people are waiting for this almost natural point, right, where it's like, okay, well, now we can stop talking about politics and being mad at each other about, feeling differently, like that point has not come up yet, right? And it might take a little bit more intentional work to create that point, because it might not, come up at all.
And not only perhaps are people not experiencing that transition point to maybe not starting to feel better, getting back to whatever normal might look like in their relationships. It seems like some people might even be feeling more tension right now. Absolutely. In their relationships. And so what's your take on that, unique to this election season?
Yeah. I mean, just following up on what Jason said, I mean, I think it's interesting because we've been in this kind of period within the last administration of just politics in your face constantly, right? And I think that's also added to a kind of fatigue, if you will, right? And so it's, that's added to the kind of dynamic of this election cycle of like, okay, it's finally a feeling of it's finally over. And then, oh, but we have to do this inauguration thing. And so I don't know, there's just been this kind of sense of fatigue, I think, that's been there. And I think that makes it difficult to kind of allow ourselves to really have those intellectual conversations about, well, what are the policies we want to support? What are the issues that are important to us? And, I mean, we've heard in a lot of the commentary, and the talking heads on television now, kind of talking about, who are we? Like the January 6th kind of, raised the question again of who are we as a country, right? And I think there's some truth to that in a way.
Mm-hmm. I think that, Christine, to your point, something that really is difficult, right? And again, right, this is not new either, but maybe is being experienced by newer groups of people lately, right, is this idea of sort of like systemic unfairness or inequality or oppression, right? Again, not new ideas, but maybe what we have now is some additional folks in the mix, right? Who, if you believe that the election was unfair, right, then what you also have, right, is now this mistrust of the system that is, allegedly designed to take care of us all, right? And so I think that that also creates more anxiety, more frustration, more hopelessness, right, at an individual level, which of course, individual level is always going to extend, right, to sort of the familial or the relationship level, right, because relationships are made up of people.
I think there's also, y'all made two great points. I think adding to that is there's this overall sense of fatigue that people are dealing with. Jason, I think you mentioned earlier, you worked with child psychology counseling, and I know from having kids and grandkids, sometimes the kid is acting up and you think it's the immediate issue that's the problem, but there's something extraneous. Their teacher got mad at them at school, they have a new teacher and they don't like him or her or whatever, and that's funneling in. I hear people say all the time, I'm so tired of COVID. I'm so tired of masks. I'm so tired of social distancing. I think there's a lot of, this past summer was a very fatiguing summer with all the social injustice, all the unrest that went on. Summers before elections are typically pretty animated because all the activity involving the election going on, but typically not the kind of summer that this past summer was. So I think there's this overall sense of fatigue that then plays into everything else that Jason and Jeremy were talking about. And it just makes the whole package a lot harder for people.
Yeah, it seems like what I'm hearing from all of you is just this sense that for a lot of people on a personal level, they're just experiencing a lot of frustration, discontent, fatigue, exhaustion from lots of different things that are going on outside of them, whether it's institutions, societal, health related, community based. And then how does that play out in relationships? It seems like perhaps some of that frustrations that we feel with these larger things that are happening then lead to heightened tension, even just within our closer relationships. Does that sound like something that you all would have seen and observed from your unique roles?
I think certainly, I think because I think also, we talked about this a bit in the last conversation that we had about this was, I'm going to call it the politicization, right, of many different ideas, right? In this sense that, now if I adhere to this, political ideology, right, then that is supposed to come along with an assumption, right, that I have to believe, right, that all these different things are supposed to go this way, or that this specific thing is bad, these types of people are good, whatever that is, right? And so I think as that has become more and more, I would say, artificially connected to values, right, that makes sort of bridging that gap within the context of relationships even harder, right? Because we're not just having a conversation at that point around, intellectually, right, as Jeremy was saying, right, this is what I think and here's why, this is what Jeremy thinks and here's why, and there's a gap right between there, right? It's, this is what I believe, and if you don't believe that, you're obviously a bad person, right? And thus I should treat you like a bad person, and vice versa.
Yeah, and I think, just to follow up on that, I agree 100%. I think COVID has kind of heightened that in the politicization of mask wearing, for example. I've even caught myself, I was in a coffee shop yesterday, in fact, and getting a cup of coffee and then going outside to sit and drink it, trying to keep social distance. But the person in front of me had no mask on. And I'm like, and I could just feel my own blood boiling. Like, why is this person getting a cup of coffee and in a building without a mask, And so, we start to attach kind of our own political values to that. And as Jason said, oftentimes it's not really well tied to to our values, but it's kind of what we perceive to be. And you know, who knows what that guy's story was? Maybe it had nothing to do with politics. Maybe it did. I don't know.
Yeah. But I think you're both correct. I think that linkage is a lot easier to make and a lot more frequently made. And when I talk with my students in my American government class, you know, I try to get them to see that, yes, if you ask me how somebody in Congress is going to vote, my first question would be, are they a Democrat or a Republican? Because that's normally a pretty decent guide. But I'll remind them that every day, whoever is president, whatever party you're in, every day members of that party vote the other way because they have constituencies they represent and they have their own values they represent. And all Republicans did not vote with Donald Trump the last 4 years. All Democrats will not vote with Joe Biden over the next 4 years. And so we have to be really careful about how we draw those connections. They're oftentimes not as valid as we think they are.
So what do you think has fed into, I'm going off the script a little bit. I hope that's okay. I think you all can handle it. But the script of questions, by the way, for those who are watching, we don't have the whole discussion scripted out, but we do have a list of questions that we share ahead of time. So what really has contributed to that sort of, you know, othering of people who might have different values? Because I think that plays out in relationships. I think, you know, Jason, you just said that it's like, you know, if you disagree on this one thing, then you're not with me, right? So how have we become so reductionist around some of these conversations?
I would say that in a lot of ways, it's that we lose nuance, right? And so I think Jeff's point is one of nuance, right? Which is that there are reasons that, you know, a Republican senator from X state might want to vote on a specific issue a certain way that are nuanced, right? That exist beyond just the sort of binary label of Republican or Democrat that we've settled on, right, in this country. And so I think that lack of nuance also helps us sort of separate into us and them, right? So because it quite literally, right, is, well, I agree with this and that's us, right? And you disagree with that and that's them, right? As opposed to, here are the reasons that I agree or disagree with this thing, and here's where there's some common ground or, you know, some shared ideology. I think the other thing that cannot go without escape is the impact that the media has had on this, right? And not just social media, right? Also the rest of the media, right? And I think the way that we talk about these things is villainizing, right? If you disagree with me or you support a certain idea, you are essentially a villain in a James Bond movie, right? Like bent on world domination, bent on world destruction, right? And which is not true. Most of us are not that way, right? And so I think that happens a lot. And I think it's also worth pointing out, like, the more you hear something, even when you know, right, that maybe it's not true, if you hear it enough, consistently enough, all the time, right, then you begin, it's like, well, but is it true, right? You begin to wonder, right? It begins to shift your perspective on these things. And so I think the sort of constant us versus them, like villainization. And I think, you know, as one side gets more radical, right, the other side gets more radical in response, right? It's like, oh, if you don't like that, then you're not going to like this thing, right? That's even more, right, out of the box. And so I think that there's also sort of this fleeing from the mean, if you will, right, in opposite directions.
I think one of the response, I mean, I think we're all in the business of kind of a response to that, right? I agree that dynamic is at play. But, you know, us in academia, our role is to try to develop people's ability to analyze and critically think about what they're seeing. And what I find really kind of disheartening and frustrating about our political landscape in the United States is I do think the media has kind of polarized this in ways, but the population doesn't, vast groups of the population, of course, there are people who do, but many people don't know how to kind of discern what are the interests underlying the reason that Democrat or that Republican voted that way, right? Sometimes that interest has to do with funding for their campaign. Sometimes it has to do with their constituents, but not always, right? If you look at the constituents and you say, okay, this, you know, a Joe Manchin from West Virginia, okay, what are his constituents really, what's really in their interests? a lot of the times he's not voting for things that are in their interest at all, right? And so you're just, like you said, Jeff, that's the type of person who oftentimes votes with the Republicans, for example, yet he's a Democrat. And I think, I feel, at least, I mean, and maybe that's partly my own self-reflection, but I feel like part of my job is to try to help educate people on how to do critical thinking and kind of get at the underlying interests. I mean, in our field of peace and conflict studies, it's, get past the positions to the underlying interests at play. And oftentimes, I don't know that a lot of our populace, and the media has certainly played into that. A lot of our populace has the skills, though, to be able to do that very well.
I think that's another area where the media can play into this. One of the elements that I talk with my students about when we're looking at the money in American politics is there in the media, there tends to be this line drawing that, well, you got money from a pro-life group, for example, so therefore you are pro-life. And this person got money from pro-choice group, therefore they are pro-choice. And what I illustrate to my students is that, does that ever occur? Absolutely. I mean, let's not be silly. Humans are humans. But most of these interest groups are not stupid people. The reason a pro-life group gives money to a candidate is because that candidate has already identified him or herself as pro-life. They didn't buy them. They gave them because they want them elected because they have that viewpoint. And that happens so many times in politics. But if you don't help people see the connection there, then they just assume that everybody in Washington or Raleigh or downtown Greensboro has been bought by somebody. And they're not trying to do what they think is morally correct or politically correct or what their constituents. It's just whoever gave them a check, that's what they're going to do. And one other quick thing I want to point out, because I mentioned this in one of my classes yesterday, I have become I've noticed this about myself, in recent months and years, I've become an ardent enemy of the definite article the. Because everybody, the reasons, and the reality is practically nothing of any import ever happens because of one reason. There's always almost always a multitude of reasons why things occur. And I told my students, I said, you'll find if you use that definite article, I'm probably going to challenge you on. I'll be gentle about it, but I'm going to challenge you because I bet there's more than one reason why whoever did whatever than just the reason. Yeah.
You reminded me of yesterday. I said to my class, there's no silver bullet theory that's going to solve all conflict.
But if Jeremy, if you could come up with one, buddy, this panel's closed. We're good.
Exactly.
I think it's also an interesting kind of intersection with what's happening at the global, national, larger system level, and then what's happening in people's families and relationships and even their own kind of mental health, because I didn't mention this earlier, but my background is also in couple and family counseling. And, as from a mental health family counseling perspective, the more people are under stress, the more they're going to default to, knee-jerk reactions perhaps, or oversimplifications. And something you had said earlier, I think, Jeremy, just made me go back to January 6th and the day, that day when all of the news started breaking. I'm working from home and back-to-back Zoom meetings that day. My older son's still remote learning. My younger son had just started going back to school like the day before. I'm trying to figure out the schedule at pickup and, just all this stress. And then I get these text messages, are you watching the news? And I'm like, I don't have time for a national crisis right now. Like, I'm in the middle of just trying to sort through my day. So, I think on a practical level, we do need to be aware when we might be defaulting to like oversimplifications or overly generalizing and just saying, this is good, or this person's good, this person's bad, or this person is with me, this person isn't with me, because just like we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, we're all under so much stress in different levels right now. And Jeremy, you're really emphasizing just how important it is to take a step back and think critically, and not rush to those quick judgments.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think just, active listening, right, in conflict is critical, right? And I think, when we turn on the TV a lot of times, whether it's CNN or even ESPN, we see this kind of debate culture where people are just reacting to beat the other person, right? So it's, it doesn't matter whether it's sports or politics. You've got this kind of competitive debate culture going on, and I think that we, and when we're stressed, as you said, we sometimes will just jump right into that, and we won't even think, take a step back and think about how, how should we, because we can't control other people's behaviors, right? We can only control our own. So how do we respond to this, as opposed to, personally, how do we respond to this, as opposed to like worrying about what the other person's saying and how am I going to win this argument?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Jeff, I want to turn to you for a little bit more kind of historical perspective too, because you're a political scientist. So you've been studying elections and their impacts for a long time. So could you just talk about what is so different about this election, and then also the aftermath of the election? And you spoke a little bit about that earlier, but what else might you add in terms of how that has really played out at the relationship level?
Well, I think a couple of the comments that were made earlier, I think it might have been Jeremy. If it's you, Jason, I apologize. I think it was Jeremy. That political conflict is not new to this country. And in fact, we could look at this campaign and go back and look at some of the campaigns in the 1800s, and we go, oh my golly, we're so nice today compared to what they were doing back in the 19th century. Even some campaigns in the early 20th century, the infamous Daisy commercial during the Johnson the Johnson Goldwater campaign in '64, where if you elect him, he's going to blow up the entire universe, kind of thing. So these conflicts are not unusual. I do think the tone has been a little different. I would imagine many politicians have called their opponents names over the years, but probably behind the screen or back in a room, not in front of a rally or on national television. So I think we've changed some of the conversational culture a little bit, and I don't think, personally, I don't think that's a positive. I try to teach my kids, my grandkids, about how you address people respectfully. Certainly, again, as I mentioned earlier, this notion of just throw in COVID, throw in the social justice, throw in it was a close election. In 5 states basically changed who won the presidency. So that you have a built-in tension. We certainly have had candidates who disliked each other at least as much as I'm sure Trump and Biden did, but the margin was so great it made no difference really whether you liked me or not. So I just think this whole process has been very, very different. And then just to quickly reiterate what I said earlier, typical elections in American history, maybe there might be a state or two, go back to the 2000 election with Bush and Gore. There's a couple of weeks where we have to have the Supreme Court come in and validate the Florida election. But even at that, once that was done, we moved on. We knew who was going to come into office, and it was just about the transition. And of course, that has not occurred in this election. And so there's just a heightened sense of tension, and no real release valve has been able to let the steam out since last year sometime. Yeah.
And so, Jason, from your view as a mental health professional, then, all that Jeff was just talking about is how it sounds like there's just such a tension buildup. So what are you seeing in terms of how people's mental health is being impacted? And this could be whether their candidate won or lost, or even if they were sort of indifferent about the election and the aftermath.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that is one of the things that stands out, right? Is it kind of doesn't matter what side of anything you were on with this election, you're probably still exhausted, right? Both physically and emotionally. And I think Christine, you maybe made the point earlier, Jeff, maybe you did too, right? That it's also, again, right, it's not just that we had a challenging election season. Right. It's that we had a challenging election season on the end of, or not the end, right, in the midst of a global pandemic, in the midst, right, of continued, racial injustice and uprisings and that type of thing. And so I think, people are afraid, right? I think people, not afraid, although some people are afraid, right? But their nerves are afraid, right? They are just, I think, emotionally exhausted. They're having a really hard time. And then when you mix emotional exhaustion with a lack of emotional resources, right, then you get mental health concerns, right? And relationship problems, and so it's like the more sort of run down we all feel emotionally, right, the easier it is, right, to quiet that voice in your brain that says, Marge, who makes the coffee, is probably not actually a fascist, and so I shouldn't treat her like one, right? And it's like, 11 months into a pandemic, right? It's like, no, Marge has to get it with both barrels, right? And so I think that that's where we're happening, right? What we're seeing is the increase in conflict, the increase in tension is, I think, a direct result of just, the world seemingly will not let up, right, on people's just sort of day-to-day existence.
I just think that people's individual mental health really does play out a lot in their relationships. And you mentioned if people don't have a lot of resources or they don't have a lot of tools to navigate those mental health challenges, the same thing could be said for relationship skills too. I mean, it would take a pretty high level of relationship skills to be able to navigate some of these differences. I think it takes a lot of relationship skills just to be able to navigate the stress that we're all under these days. So add on top of that major rifts and differences and perspectives and opinion. And, it's kind of a recipe for a lot of challenges within relationships. So Jeremy, I want to turn to you for a few minutes. I really kind of want to pick your brain. I've just often wondered, like, what is Jeremy thinking right now as he's kind of been looking at the post-election and just how polarized the world is right now and how black and white, and all of these judgments that people have. So from a conflict and peace studies or conflict resolution perspective, if you had two people who are just completely on the opposite ends of the spectrum, whatever that might mean on whatever issue you're talking about, just don't see eye to eye, they feel totally disconnected and just opposite and not just opposite, but at opposition with the other person, what can your field of conflict and peace studies teach us about how people with vastly different views of the world could at least start to lay the groundwork for maybe trying to connect?
Yeah, and maybe before I'm not a political scientist or a political historian, but maybe before answering that question, just responding to the comments before as well, I think in my perspective, this election cycle has been even weirder or different and stranger in a way, not just because of COVID, but because you had two people running, at the national level who were so polar opposites in terms of character, right? This idea of empathy versus strength. I heard one of the pundits on PBS, I think, was talking about how that's what the choice is, empathy versus strength, right? And you can figure out who falls in those boxes, right? And I think that people got really tired of that too, because it's like this desire to want to be able to connect and have some empathy, particularly in the times of COVID. I think really, and it was a close election, but I think that may have been what propelled Joe Biden to the White House. So I was just thinking about that as you guys were talking in relation to, and so given that context of this kind of, crazy situation we find ourselves in, and how do you then get people together to talk? I think the first thing that comes to mind in the question you asked for me is just being able to listen to the other person and listening. And, I mentioned active listening before, but when I say listening, I mean listening in a way that you're not trying to convince them of your side or not trying to, or even agreeing with them, but listening in an empathetic way that says, okay, I hear what you're saying. I don't necessarily agree with what you're saying, and not listening in the sense of agreement or tolerance necessarily, because there's some of these views on certain sides of issues are really, abhorrent to people, right? And so I think we have to be able to call that out and say, hey, I hear what you're saying, and I can try. And it goes back to that analysis piece I was saying before. I can kind of understand maybe where you may have gotten that idea. So I think first it's listening and trying to, show respect to the other person, and then, try to kind of come to agreement on the facts, which in this in this context of, social media and QAnon and others, it's hard to figure out what are the facts, right? But coming to some agreement, and in the if it's not possible to come to agreement on the facts, then just check, again, you can only control yourself, not others. So just check yourself in terms of not getting pulled into that kind of debate mentality, but continue to try to dialogue. And the role of dialogue is to listen for understanding, not for persuasion, right? And so I would say that for me would be the, listen to understand and not agree, and then move to kind of some talking about the facts, trying to figure out what they are. And then if you can't come to agreement, agree to say, hey, look, we need to move on from this conversation. We need to, I'm not going to be pulled into a debate about something that I know your theory of Pizzagate or whatever is completely false. There's no evidence to show that, right? So yeah, I mean, that's the way I think about it. And admittedly, that's not, I mean, again, it's not a silver bullet response that there's one way you can deal with this thing, right? There are some relationships where you're just going to have to kind of say, okay, we're going to have to agree to disagree on that fact and move forward and try to humanize the other person as best we can.
Anyone else want to, Jeff or Jason, do you want to share any thoughts on that? I saw a lot of head nodding.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jason.
No, go for it.
Well, I'll just, what Jason, Jeremy had mentioned this earlier, and what he said then, just moving on. Because one of the things we talked about in the first discussion we did earlier, last year, and I'm sure we'll come back to it today in some way, is who we are is so much more than just what we believe about politics. And so even as Jeremy was accurately saying, we try to converse with each other. We try to really, as you said, actively listen, try to understand. But at the end of the day, if I'm A and you're Z, this is just one area, and we have entire lives which are not made up by who I voted for last November. And so, okay, we just can't come to an agreement. Then let's move on. And let's talk about other things that we most likely could agree on, which have much more to do with life and our kids and our neighborhood, or where we work together or whatever, and leave that behind us, if you will.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point, and Jeremy was making a lot of great points as well, which from what I was thinking about, right, is some of the sort of relationship skills, right, that we teach, right, when we do families and couples therapy, right? And when we think about, there's been I would say, Christine probably would agree with me, that relationships are all about rupture and repair, right? And so there are always ruptures, right? And in whatever relationship we're talking about, parental relationships, romantic relationships, coworker relationships, right? It's the repair piece that actually matters. And I think it's worth remembering one of the ways that we repair those ruptures, right? I'll use romantic relationships as an example, right? Is to have couples refocus on, like, why is it that you came to love this person in the first place? I think that that's a worthwhile question for us to be asking ourselves about the people in our lives. Why? Here's the truth. It is a choice to have the people in your life who are in your life. Even your blood relatives, right? It is a choice to have them in your life. So if they are still present, it means that you are actively making the decision to keep them in your life. Why is that? And if it's for a valid, good, positive reason, refocus on that. Think about that. Not everyone is going to find that, right? So sometimes it's just habit, right? And so, we are about relationship building here and not relationship ending. But sometimes the healthiest thing for a relationship is to end. But I think that that's rare. I think if we sit and we ask ourselves the question, like, why do I love the people in my life? You would be hard pressed to find an example of someone where it's like, I only love Jeff because he's a Republican, right? And I only love Christine, right? It's like, not because he's nice, not because he's funny, like, not because he has a cool beard, right? Like, the only thing drawing me to him, right, is this one thing. I think you would be hard pressed to find people in your life who exist in that way. And so it's really worth thinking about and then trying to recommit to this idea of, like, this is something that I value about you, and you also add value to my life, and I want that to stick around.
I think those are all such great reminders for people, and just kind of practical things for them to apply into their relationships. I mean, certainly, I hope we would all agree that if there's, abuse or aggression or hurtful things that are being said, walk away from that conversation. You do not need to subject yourself to that, and you should find safety and find the support you need from other places. And so, I think that leaves us in the gray space then, because there will be some people, and we'll talk about that in a minute, where it's just, I need to totally disconnect myself from this person or this relationship. This relationship needs to end because this person has crossed the line. And then there's going to be other times where it's like, wow, I really care about this person. I have all these reasons in my life why I want them there. And yet, we have this area where we really seriously disagree. And, then how do we navigate that? Do we say, let's move on and let's just agree to disagree about this? Or can I have enough of a spirit of wanting to understand them, or maybe using this as an opportunity to get to know this other person better and know this particular thing about them? So I think there's just a lot of, it's complicated, but especially when there's a desire to, especially when there's a desire to preserve a relationship, and it needs to be repaired. Or sometimes we can desire to preserve relationships. And then other times, if we're talking about a workplace colleague, neighbor, I just was walking through, I think I mentioned some yard signs in our last one. Another part of the neighborhood this past week, there's still just right across the street from these two neighbors. I don't know them, but people, living in a different part of the neighborhood, totally opposing yard signs. It was pretty clear there was some back and forth between them, so short of moving, what can you do then? And it sounds like part of what I'm hearing is, listening to understand, agreeing to disagree at times, but are there other practical tips that any of you might have around how to actually talk about differences with other people?
Yeah, I mean, and I was thinking about this in relation to the question that Patty posed in the chat, on our Zoom, and let's just assume, take that yard sign example you gave, and assume your neighbor's the guy who was out on January 6th with the Camp Auschwitz shirt on, right? I mean, I think you have to call that out. I think you can do it in respectful ways, though, right? Because that's offensive, right? And it's problematic, and we should. In my mind, there is a level of kind of a value that we should be obtaining as a society, and and staying to, and saying, look, this is not okay. Wearing that shirt in the neighborhood or putting that sign up in your yard, let's say, is not okay. Now, I mean, if it's one political candidate and the other political candidate, we live in a country where people are free to have their political beliefs, right? And so, so I mean, I guess I would just say, like, I think we do have to call certain conflicting views out, but we also have to say, you know what, I'm not going to sit here and engage with the guy with the Camp Auschwitz shirt on and get into kind of a violent debate or tussle back and forth with him. I can control my actions. I can call it out and walk away, right? And if that person happens to be a family member, an uncle, somebody who's who is, or even a work colleague, then I think you have to think clearly about how do you engage with that person, and how do you make it clear to them that, like, it is not okay what happened, and what, your view is really just not okay. And so you're not kind of supporting, kind of tangentially, or in ways that aren't indirectly supporting a really kind of problematic viewpoint.
Yeah, it's interesting. In my mind, there's like a little more nuance to that, right? Which is this, and this is one of the more psychologist things that I'm going to say today, right? I think it's worth separating thoughts and beliefs from behaviors, right? And so I would argue that there's nothing I can do. It doesn't matter if I think it's fine or not, right? That this person believes whatever it is that they believe, right? We can have a conversation about behavior, right? So the wearing of a Camp Auschwitz shirt, right? Like the yelling of, at me on Twitter, right? The whatever it is, right? That's a behavior. And so if the way that you choose to express your thoughts and beliefs is abusive, right, in its behavior, then that is problematic. And we should spend some time talking about that and unpacking that, right? But the fact that you believe X, Y, or Z isn't in and of itself, right, a problem for the rest of us, right? Like maybe it is in fact for you because it creates a lot of tension, a lot of conflict, and a lot of sort of uncertainty, right? But just the presence of that thought itself, right, isn't a problem.
I think
go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I think part of what's interesting is, you know, we talk a lot about being peacemakers. And I think what I find in many instances is what people typically mean by peacemaking. I was thinking this morning about an old MASH episode from, you know, I am so much older than y'all, from a long time ago. And there were the characters, not important, two people with this conflict, and the general colonel gets them together and says, all right, let's make up. And one guy says, well, I'll shake your hand if you'll put your hand out first. And the other guy said, well, I'll shake your hand if you put your hand out first, you know. And I think what we have to be willing to do is go, look, if I truly believe in reaching across the aisle, I have to reach. You know, I can't wait for him or her. I have to do something. And it may, as you were saying, Jeremy, it may turn out that their belief system is so different from mine, or Jason, the behavioral system is so different from mine. You know, this side of seeing an ambulance in their front yard, I may never cross the street to talk to them again. I mean, just, you know, reality is. But until I have at least put the arm across the street and tried, then we don't have, I don't think, a lot of possibilities of being able to get things done. And one of the differences, I didn't think about this earlier, Christine, in politics, is that it was 50 years ago a regular event for political opponents to socialize together. Call each other whatever names you want on the floor of the House or the Senate, but at 7 o'clock that night, back then it was mostly a male system, you and your wife were going to have lunch or dinner with the other guy that you just called, you know, some political version of a gravy sucking pig, and his wife, you know, because it was political, not personal. And on the national scale, and I think somewhat on the state scale as well, I think we've lost some of that dynamic as well. That, again, as we talked before, it just gets so personal nowadays. But if we do, in fact, want relationships to change, waiting around for somebody else to do something is not the strategy.
Yeah, that's a really powerful example. My dad's an attorney, and I remember he would say that he's had times where he was on opposite sides of arguing a case, and, you know, they would be fighting in the courtroom and then go to dinner later. And I do just think that there is something that has, you know, kind of changed in our culture around being willing and able to kind of bridge past differences. There's becoming more, as there becomes more and more, I think, division, there becomes more and more of a desire for people to be among people that they feel comfortable and that they agree with, you know, and so bridging that. And we've got some really good questions. I know, Jeremy, you already touched a little bit on one of the questions, but there was also a related private question too, you know, around, especially if you have that opportunity to be in relationship with somebody, and somebody might have a viewpoint or a belief system that is hurtful to other people. There's probably different levels of spectrum. It might just be a difference of opinion all the way to something that is hurtful. The example of racism or white supremacy was given in the chat room. So how do you try to, you know, talk to people who have that level of difference, especially as you were mentioning, Jeff, around just for those who want to work toward peace in their relationships and want to strive for opportunities to connect with people until it becomes clear that you shouldn't, you know, like you said, that there might be a decision to say, I'm not going to talk with this neighbor unless there's a real crisis, because I just know I can't go there. But while you're trying, you know, how do you maybe, I don't want to use the word confront, or call out was the word in the private question that was submitted. How do you sort of call out views that you may actually see as hurtful, whether or not the other person might see that?
Yeah, I mean, I was just in listening to Jeff talk too. I was thinking the simple kind of idea from Bill Urey and the folks at Harvard School of Negotiation, getting to yes. They talk about separating the people from the problem, right? So, I mean, I think that's critical to, and it just kind of reiterates what Jeff was saying, is being able to kind of, and that's what why you saw Tip O'Neill as the House Speaker be able to go out and hang out with the Republicans after, and there was real friendship in a sense of like, your views are not only who you are, right? I can separate the people from the problem. The call out culture kind of situation that we find ourselves in, I find fascinating. And I've been trying to kind of get a better sense of, I think it's a great question. I don't know that I have real good answers. I go back to I think you do need to call out. I think the way in which people are calling out on the internet and really ruining people's lives over maybe something not thought out that they said, or even something that is hugely problematic. Again, the one behavior that you did doesn't define you as a human being. And it goes back to a very punitive sense that we have of justice in this country, right? Where, we punish people and lock them up for the rest of their lives without the ability to reform themselves. And I would argue that no, actually, we're a combination of all the things we do, and we're not defined by one thing. And so the more we can kind of keep that in mind at the same time, I do think we need to call out those problematic things, but not in such a way that kind of ruins people's lives, which we've seen happen, right?
Yeah, I agree with you, Jeremy. I think that there's a lot of, I guess what I'll say about the call out culture, we could probably have an entire one of these, right, about cancel culture, call out culture, right, all that, but we won't do that. But I think ultimately the goal, right, of those, whether it's achieved or not is a separate question, but I think ultimately the goal, right, is for folks who have felt disempowered, right, for a really long time, to regain some measure of power, right, and how people are held accountable for the things that they say and they do, right? I think ultimately that is like an admirable, worthwhile thing. And I don't always know that, destroying you on Twitter is exactly, and getting you fired from your job is exactly, right, accomplishes that goal in any meaningful way, right? I could be wrong about that. I think in answer to Christine's question, though, I think for me, here being on the psychology side of life, we have this idea of assertiveness, right, as it relates to communication. And we think about that as this idea of expressing your opinion, expressing your view without the sort of added or side goal of convincing the other person that you are right and they are wrong, right? Or swaying them to coming over to your side. And so when we think about this idea of like, based on the question, right, calling out, right, these sort of difficult or abusive or challenging ideas, I think that's really the point, right? Is sort of saying like, when you say that, it is hurtful. And I'm not arguing that you should stop saying it, right? Although I would very much like that, because I am hurt when you say it, right? What I am saying, right, and what I am acknowledging in this moment is that the behavior that you have engaged in caused harm. And I would like for you to reckon with that harm, right? And if that means we have a continued conversation about that, great, right? If that means that you need to go home, also great, right? If that means that you just don't say that kind of thing to me anymore, I'm fine with that, right? Again, right? I think it's worth separating the belief from the, behavior.
Yeah, it just came to a minute ago. One of the things that's the most frustrating about this panel is that I have to begin every comment with, I agree with everything Jason and Jeremy just said. It's just really tiresome after a while, but y'all are really good. But I think as part of that in the culture that we're in, the call out culture, the questions that run through my mind is, first, what's the point of the call out? Why are you doing it? And there are good reasons to do it. And there are reasons, I just want to show you how stupid or how horrible or how mean or whatever you are. And I would argue that's not as good. And then after that, then there are a couple of questions. And one would be, why do you believe what you believe? I'm not going to attack your belief, but what is it? Where does that come from? I think the example I gave in the earlier panel was, my dad was raised in Eastern North Carolina in an incredibly segregated world. And in the 60 plus years that he lived, if he ever used a word other than the N word, I never heard it. Now, that does not in any way, shape, or form allow him, well, that's okay that he did that. No, it's not okay. But I understand where that came from. And I was raised in a very different period of time. And so I had a different set of experiences, which allowed me to see the harm that word did to people and to recognize it as an unacceptable word, which, as I shared with y'all, I then taught down. And then the other question I would ask is, and I think, Jason, you were really getting to this, is do you understand the hurt you give to me when you use that term? When, Jeremy, when you wear that t-shirt, you know, when whatever it is, you may choose to keep doing it, but do you understand the damage that I feel, or that my daughter feels, or our neighbor, our coworker feels, when you use that terminology or when you have that belief? Because as long as you do, at that point, I've done about all I can do. You know, then it's really in your court to change, not change. That's between you and your God, or, you know, whatever your value systems are. But at least if I can understand for myself why you think the way you do, and if you can understand, okay, you can believe that, but you do harm people when you say that or do that, then I think we've made at least some progress. Probably haven't solved the issue, but I think at least we've worked on it.
Yeah, it's an attempt to create empathy, right? And emotional learning, social emotional learning that, you know, and I think if we go into those conversations with that mindset that we want to try to help that person grow socially and emotionally around whatever their behavior is, right? Then that's what we can do. And then it's on them to either accept that or not, right?
Yeah, I think it's also worth saying, right, that because this comes up sometimes, particularly in like marginalized communities, it is a choice, right, that each of us can choose to make or not make, right, to be the educator, right, or take on responsibility of helping you develop your social and emotional learning, right? And so it's like, it's no one's mandate or requirement to do that. And so, you know, not to at all disagree with you, Jeremy, I think, but when you are making the intentional decision, right, it's like, you know what, I have 20 minutes, right? Let's see if we can hash this out, right? Then absolutely, you know, that makes sense. But everyone is also free to decide, you know, I'm tired and COVID is a thing and I don't want to talk about this right now. So I'm going to go back to my office, right? And maybe we'll talk about it later.
Yeah.
But I think that really, I've just been sitting with how valuable even just some really basic relationship and communication strategies can be. You know, do you dive right into the conversation, or do you say, you know, I have had some things on my mind that I'd like to know if you would be open to a conversation about? Or I heard you say this thing earlier today, or I noticed that shirt that you're wearing, or the post that you made on social media. I had some thoughts and feelings about it. Would you be open to talking about it sometime? You know, a lot of times I think people just dive right in. And John Gottman, who's a very famous marriage researcher, talks about the soft startup. And that feels so like it would almost revolutionize some of these conversations. Like, how do you, like, you don't say you're a horrible person for saying this or for doing that. You kind of invite the conversation in a soft way. And his research with couples, you know, has really shown that how you start a conversation, it just almost has everything to do with how it's going to end, right? Like if you come into it with a soft approach, a respectful tone, which I should say, you know, I think anyone who's sort of an observer on social media or commentary on the news, we don't see a lot of examples of soft startup, and really there's not space for it in those forums. Right. But when we're talking about interpersonal relationships that we have to have, want to have, you know, hope that we can have, you know, we can really think about how do you set the tone even from the beginning of those conversations. And you're saving, I should say too, you're also saving yourself a lot of stress if somebody says, I don't want to hear it, you know, or I don't care what you have to say about what I said or whatever, you know, like a lot of people, you know, might let you know off the bat versus trying to go into that conversation. Any thoughts on that or other sort of communication strategies?
I was shaking my head when you said that, because I think interpersonally, you're exactly right. But online, that becomes a lot harder. And a lot of the conflicts that we see between, I mean, I was thinking, I think last time I shared about a cousin who, you know, has a very different political views than I. And at one point he posted, this is before the election, he posted something about, tell me one thing that Trump has done wrong. And it was like, I have a zillion things I could post there, right? And so like the way he started that question, and of course, your immediate reaction is to just fire back. And so of course it escalated with me and other family members into a pretty big kind of online argument. Whereas if we were around a dinner table in person, and of course that's hard during times of COVID, but assuming we were interpersonally having this conversation, it's a lot easier to say, well, let me ask you why you asked that question, because to me that question's faulty to begin with, right? And to start to engage with a conversation. And so like that soft landing or the soft kind of entryway, I think is really much easier in some ways in person.
I think so.
Go ahead, Jason.
Oh, I think I was going to add, I think that it is in some ways easier in person. And I think that, it's really important, and I think Christine is getting at this too. Do what you can to ensure that your goals and your strategies are in alignment, right? So if what I want in this scenario is to make you feel bad and or hurt you because you have hurt me, right? There is a way to accomplish that. Right? In the way that I frame my questions and the way that I frame my comments and whether I use the soft startup or not, right? If my goal is to initiate a conversation about this in the hopes that we can grow from this, right? Then I need to approach that differently, right? It will not work to approach that as a goal, right? With the strategy that you would use to like seek revenge, right? For someone who said something to harm you.
And I think just adding to, I think that's one of we've talked in the previous panel about the impact of social media. It's very difficult to have any kind of reasonable conversation, except with people with whom you already agree on social media. And if we could manage to find strategies to, cut our social media presence in half and devote that time to interpersonal relationship and conversations, I think we would make some real progress in where we're going. But it's just so easy to post a question or post a comment, and then because I did this a couple of years ago, somebody posted something, I made what I thought was a fairly benign comment. It probably wasn't as benign as I thought it was, but relatively. And then I'm interacting with like 300 people. I have no idea who these people are, and clearly some of them were raised differently from the way I was raised, whatever. And I thought, I got to get out of here, and I just signed out and let it go. It'd been far better if the person was a friend of mine, if I'd called them up, or the next time I saw them in person, as several of y'all have suggested, can we chat about this for a second? Because I was sort of put off, but I'd like to know where it came from. And, but again, that's part of what has made COVID so difficult, is that those normal personal interactions that we would have at a restaurant, in the hallway here at UNCG, or at church or a restaurant where you're normally interacting with people and talking with folks, we're just not having a lot of those. So much of it gets driven to social media, because at least you're connecting, just not in a real way.
And I do think it's really helpful to just make yourself a general rule that the closer you can get to an in-person conversation, if it's not an actual in-person conversation as possible, especially due to COVID, or, being across the country from somebody that you just can't see, and hash that out. Think about a video chat or a phone call, or a longer email versus a text exchange versus social media. There's sort of like a hierarchy of thought and reaction and thinking time that goes into conversations. And if you're approaching a difficult topic or something where there's a potential for conflict, and this is true, in my view, this is sort of true whether we're talking about elections or, whose turn it is to take out the trash within a family or a couple. The more chance for conflict, the more important it is to save a conversation for later. And, I like what you said too, Jeff, just really being mindful about, where you're interacting online too, because, we just have to sort of acknowledge the world that we're living in right now can be very hostile and quick to judge and pick apart. And, I don't know if any of you, watch school board meetings or, the daily briefings on COVID or things, and just the, hate that is often kind of in every direction, you know, just so quick. And it's like one or two sentences that from people who don't even know each other, you know, and maybe some people like that. I would not find that to be fun to engage in that kind of conversation. So I would avoid it. But I think, you know, being mindful about that and just making choices for yourself. And I can honor that there might be some people who think it's important to engage in those places of dialogue as well. But I just think, you know, thinking about what can be the most accurate, close representation of an in-person conversation. And then I think also when there are social media or text, I've heard a lot of people who talked about like family or friend group chat, you know, group texts, where there's conflict too, you know, just keeping in mind, somebody does say or do something that's offensive, you know, it's a sentence or two probably, right? And it might be very hurtful. And it also, just as has been mentioned before, that does not necessarily reflect their whole true character as summarized by this one comment that you saw them make, or this one, you know, post that they made, or a text that they sent.
And I think it's easier to do again in person than I was thinking also as you were talking about online, and this is a little different direction, but just the kind of addictiveness of it, right? That we respond quickly, but we also get sucked in to that the conflict kind of draws us in. It's like, oh, we can do this from afar, and you get kind of addicted to it. So sometimes I think we get caught in this kind of like you said, Jeff, you walked away from that 300 per. Some people will actually, I think a lot of us will actually go, oh, this is kind of interesting. What if I type this and see what happens, right?
I get to show more people how stupid they are. Though this is great. Yeah, it's for many folks that it's hard to catch this, and I certainly understand it. But there will be a day when we'll all look back at 2020 and find good things that came out of it. And I think, although I certainly hope, I look forward to the day when Zoom is never a factor in a class that I ever teach again. Okay. By the same token, 2 weeks ago, one of our alumni from UNCG, one of my former students, I've got to know her family a little bit, had some real physical issues while she was here. She's now got a job up in city government up in Rutherfordton, North Carolina. We had an hour and a half Zoom conversation, and I could see her. We gotten to know each other. I asked her a question. I said, no, I'm watching your face. Come on, what's going on? You know, it's just so different from just talk, even on the phone, just hearing a voice and not being able to see how they're reacting. So there's, you know, there are pieces of this that somewhere down the road, I think we'll retain and will be helpful. But then there are other elements, of course, hopefully we'll jettison as quickly as we possibly can. But that interpersonal reaction is just, or interaction, excuse me, is just so critical.
Yeah. Christine, I wanted to say that, you know, you brushed up against something in your comment that I think really is important and bears sort of highlighting, which is that, you know, not every moment is the right moment to have a challenging conversation. Right. And so the time to talk about like the division of labor and who should take out the trash, right, and how often is not when the trash has overflown and there's trash all over the floor, right? That's probably a bad time to have that conversation, right? When there's like no trash, right, and everybody is like cooler, right, we're not activated by the trash. That's the time to have the conversation around like, you know, what would it be like if you took the trash out like 3 times a week, right? And I think the same is true for any type of challenging or potentially conflictual conversation, right? If you are furious, it's probably not a good time to have that conversation, right? Because when we are furious, I'm pretty good at talking, I'm pretty good at negotiation, I'm pretty good at all that jazz, right? When I am furious, I'm none of those things, I'm a lunatic, right? My wife will tell you that. And so I think when it's important for me to have a needed and necessary challenging conversation, I have to make sure that like I'm in the right spot to do that emotionally, right? Cognitively, right? So that I can continue to espouse like my values, right? To live up to the things that are important to me. There's a type of professional that I want to be. There's a type of a husband, friend, relative, right, that I want to be. And it's harder to be that person when I am furious.
Yeah, those are great points. Jeremy, looks like you have something to add.
Well taken. I was going to follow up with a question because you know, I'm thinking if I do that, which I feel like I do with my son all the time with the trash, you know, the trash thing triggered me and it still doesn't work. What do I do?
Well, I am a child psychologist who focuses on parent training, so we could have an entire conversation about that.
I'll make it short. You
Yeah.
call Jason the lunatic and say, come over here.
That's right. That's
Exactly.
right. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it really is about being able to sort of circle the plane back around, right? And understanding that it's like you were likely, and again, this I think extends to everything, but you were likely going to have more than a single conversation about this, right? If the way that it worked for most of us was that we had a single conversation and then we changed our behavior, right? Parents would probably be less stressed out. I would not have a job, right? Right. So I think it's expecting that it's like, okay, well, I told you this, at this point, we're going to probably need to revisit this at some point. Now, that said, that is normal, right? And it's also very irritating, right? We don't like to have multiple conversations, right?
And with a 14-year-old, it's more than just a few, right?
Absolutely. And so I think it is setting up for kids. It's a little different, right? So it is setting up like expectations and then, positive and negative consequences in response to, meeting said expectations. I think with your coworkers, right, you don't quite do it in the same way, right? So you don't send them to their room because they were, bad or right. So it's a little bit different there. Yeah.
So we are down to about our last 15 minutes. So I do want to put out a little quick reminder for those who are live with us in Zoom or Facebook. If you have any questions for our panelists, your time for submitting them is running low. So make sure you get those in if you have any questions. But I actually have another just question that I want to throw out there because I would really like to get your thoughts about this. It's something that I've personally thought a lot about this election season and the aftermath of it up till now. And I would suspect those who are watching a program like this might have a similar thought to this. Whether we're talking today, 2 months from now, 6 months from now, if you are at all troubled or distraught about how divisive and contentious this election season has been, and you on an individual level, in your own sphere of influence, want to be part of building bridges between people who have serious differences, or, working toward a society in which people can have difficult conversations in a respectful tone, even when they really disagree. Sometimes I think we might feel hopeless when we think about that. Like, wow, we're just so far gone, there's nothing I can do. But I don't like to think that way. I like to be, who said earlier, glass 3/4 full. That might've been in our pre-conversation. Yeah. So if we're glass 3/4 full people, for those of us who think, I want to do something, but what can I do to change the world, in a positive way, at least, and as best I can, what can I do? So I guess I'm trying to think, like, move a little bit beyond, one-on-one relationships, family, workplace, but also like at the community, society level. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. We did not pre-plan that question, so you might want to think about it, but I would welcome any insights that you might share.
Well, let me start on that, because actually something that come to me earlier in an earlier question I was hoping to have a chance to come back to. I think one of the things we could do is to look around for folks, absent the political conversations, who's hurting, who's suffering. I shared with one of my classes earlier this week, and I would imagine, and I'm not trying to prejudge y'all on the screen, but I would imagine all of us on the panel have the same experience. I've made money on the pandemic. Okay, I didn't have any salary loss. My wife's retired. Nothing happened to Social Security. We both got stimulus checks and waiting for 2 more to show up. Okay, now in the great scheme of the universe, we didn't, nobody's getting rich, but we understand that our life experience for the last almost year has been very different from the life experience a lot of folks are going through. I mean, another reason for the enhanced anger, if you will, maybe unrest might be a better word, would be there are folks who are worried about losing their jobs, about losing their homes, about, will I have enough money to take care of my kids or my elderly? I've got folks in my church haven't seen their fathers or grandparents in months because of COVID. So I would suggest one of the things we could do is look around your universe for people who are hurting in some way. And so, yeah, I don't care what you think. I don't care who you voted for. What I see is there something I could do to assist you in some way, which may end up being the soft start to a conversation down the road. But don't even do it for that. If you do it for that reason, don't do it. Go find somebody else. Just try to help somebody who needs a hand, who needs a yard mowed or groceries bought, or, I do the positive things. One of the reasons I stay engaged in social media is I do see folks who will post on, they were standing in line at Food Lion, and the person behind them, the person before them said, I'm buying their groceries too, or just those small, what we used to call random acts of kindness. Those are still really, really powerful and help people get beyond the immediacy of the pain they're in. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, in the context of your question too, thinking of in the context of COVID, it does become difficult, right? Because my first reaction was kind of I was thinking my first reaction was educate, organize, agitate, which is something that B.R. Ambedkar, a guy that I study, a former head of the Indian drafter of the Constitution, and he's passed away, but kind of a social reformer in India. He ended all his speeches with that: organize, educate, agitate, right? So, I mean, I thought of that, but then as I was listening to Jeff too, I mean, I was reminded by Brian Stevenson. He wrote a book called Just Mercy, and he talks about being proximate, right? Being proximate to suffering, right? And I think that's, so I really appreciate what Jeff had to add to that. I think that's important for us to realize that, okay, we might be benefiting from the current context, but there's other people who are really suffering from it. And so being proximate to that suffering, I think, is important. And then, I mean, in the times of COVID, I do think educating yourself, right? So not just reading the same social media posts or the same news agency, but reading other things and picking up books that, over the break, I read a book about white supremacy, right? And kind of the history of it. And it gave me a whole new perspective on what happened on January 6th. It gave me a whole new kind of like, this isn't something that just came out of nowhere, right? It's been with us, right? And kind of, reminding ourselves of that through educating ourselves when we can't get together and have those dialogues with other people. Obviously we can do it over Zoom or things like that, but, we can't have those interpersonal conversations like we normally would. So take the time to kind of be selfish in a way and educate yourself and spend time with yourself.
Jeff, now I get to say it. I agree with everything that's been said. I do think I really appreciate your comment about the importance of helping other people, right? Because I do think, right, again, when we talk about how do we fix relationships, how do we get to that repair after a rupture, right? It's remembering that you care about people and people care about you in ways that don't have anything to do with the way that you vote, right? And so the fact that this other person is hurting and it is within my power to be of use or of aid to them in some way, shape, or form is, I think, very comforting, right? Also, and helps us get past some of this divide where, it's like politics are important. They matter. And also, I think, to go back to one of the earlier questions, I think one of the issues that we have, right, is that politics have really become this be all end all, right? Whereas, I think, Jeff, you were making this point before where it's like it used to be, right, where it's like, okay, well, like there's politics and there's like the rest of life, right? And so now it just seems so much more integrated. And so I think that's one of the ways of teasing that apart. And then I think, Jeremy, to your point, this is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about and going back and forth with is sort of how is it that you balance, right? Sort of curating a space that is safe as the opposite of abusive, right? And not closing yourself off, right, to differences in perspective and ideas that might be able to help you grow, right? Because I think, so I, right, as a person of color, right, have oftentimes sort of had this reaction, right? And people are like, oh, well, like that just builds an echo chamber, right? You shouldn't unfriend people on Facebook who think differently than you. And there's a part of me that sort of feels like, yeah, but like, that's not a safe space to be, right? Like, there's a reason that I don't have a bunch of friends who are white supremacists, right? Like, that is not a safe space, right, for me to be. And so, but also, right, like, how do I prevent from creating like, well, I only want to be around people who think like I think. Right. Or believe what I believe. Yeah. Right. And so that there is some level of midpoint, right, between those two extremes.
Yeah.
Those are all...
and equally to that point, there are gradations. Mm-hmm. That's that category. There are gradations of white supremacists.
Right.
Just we taught. I think one of the first things we talked about was our lumping of people into a group. If I make this comment, I'm a white supremacist. Well, I may be, okay, but not necessarily because of that particular comment, So that's a good point. Sorry, Christine.
No, I was just going to say I appreciated hearing all of your perspectives on that question. I asked that question somewhat for selfish reasons because it's one that I've been mulling over a lot. But what I really heard was sort of that balance between putting good into the world and being a model of that to others, or, not doing it for being a model, but just doing it for the sake of doing it and for putting kindness and goodness into the world. And then also needing to learn, recognizing your need to learn and reflect and be open to dialogue and connections with people who are the same and different from you. And so I think those are all just such really good points. I hate to say it, but we're almost at the end of our time. The hour and a half has really flown by. So before we wrap up, and so we can finish on time at 1:30, I would like to ask each of you to share your final thoughts and kind of takeaway for today's discussion. So let's start with, let's go, and do I have the reverse alphabetical order that we started with? So let's start with Jeremy, and then we'll go to Jason and Jeff.
Even though we're all J's, right?
I know, it's so confusing.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what I said before about kind of listening to try to understand and build spaces where you could have dialogue and not debate certainly stands out to me. I mean, I think the other theme I've heard running through all of our talks is like, how to be you mentioned model or role model, or how to be an archetype of what the values you want to envision and to see. And like, you can't change other people's minds all the time, but you can act in particular ways, and you can, exhibit the behavior you'd like others to actually exhibit. Right. And doesn't work for everybody. It doesn't mean that just by me doing what I think is right, everybody else is going to follow along. Don't we all wish that's the way the world worked, right? But we can be that kind of model and archetype for then others to point to and hopefully emulate or follow or be a beacon, if you will. So I think that for me is like the things in this kind of trying time, the kinds of things that we can practice personally, right? That doesn't take others to do, right? It takes ourselves.
Thanks, Jeremy. Jason, your final thoughts?
Sure. I think that for me, what has stood out about this conversation is just a reminder, right, which I need sometimes too, that being in relationship with other people successfully requires a skill set, right? And so like we can learn to do that better and more effectively like we learn to do anything else, right? Which is one of the reasons that I'm always happy to work with HRI. I think the other thing that really stands out is this idea of sort of living your values, right? And sort of at the end of the day, I think we can't control other people. We can't change other people, right? My whole job is behavior change. I'm here to tell you, we can't change other people. What we can do is live our values, right? And do and say the things that are important to us, right? And work towards the good of causes that are important to us. And there are times that other people will see that and will want to come and join you, right? And those are also relationships that are worth fostering and facilitating.
Thanks, Jason. Jeff?
Two quick things. One, we've referenced January 6th a few times this afternoon, And I remember sitting on my couch watching the events of that afternoon and early evening, and wondering how I was going to talk about that in my classes, because one of the points I use with my students is, for all the things, you know, when Obama was elected, there were people who were mad. When Trump elected, there were people who were mad. And the system still works. The system still stands. And that afternoon and early evening, I was wondering what I would tell my students. And then that night, 1 a.m., the election was done and the system still stood. And whether you were supporters of Donald Trump or supporters of Joe Biden or any of the other candidates who ran, the system still worked. And my second comment that I would make is, there's going to be a day when we're beyond COVID, and the kind of normal day-to-day interactions that we're all used to having with our friends, with our families, with our coworkers, the hallway, which is terribly silent outside my door, is going to be filled again. You know, people are going to be interacting in restaurants, sitting side by side at bars, at movie theaters, whatever. We're going to be outside of our homes and going into our neighbors' houses and being able to, the day is going to come when this is going to be a whole lot easier. And I would suggest we just hang on as best we can, look forward to that day, because it's going to get here. And that will give us, because as Jeremy and Jason both said, some of these things are really very, and you also, Christy, very personal. The day of personal is going to come back. This is not the new normal. This is the now. There will be another normal, and it won't be this, you know, so hang in there. We'll get there.
Those are all such great summarizing points and just great, really takeaways. We're getting some feedback in the chat room here just about how helpful this discussion has been, both the kind of shared with everybody, and then I've gotten a couple of back channel messages too. So we hope a lot of people will benefit. I'm sure that they will, that there'll be just a lot of people who are going to return to this conversation. We'll continue to share it through the Healthy Relationships, and just really appreciate your time. It's just so great to hear, you know, different perspective, different lenses, both personally and professionally. I think that's what all of you have really brought to the conversation. So with that, I'm going to wrap us up and just say thank you again to all of you, our experts, for being here, as well as to the participants in Zoom, on Facebook. If you're watching it later, we're just glad that you're here, and we hope that you'll stay connected with the Healthy Relationships Initiative for more programs and resources for healthy relationships. We need them, you know, we need them perhaps more now than ever. We appreciate just everybody's support and involvement. So with that, we'll sign off, and just thank you again for being here today. And we will share this video, will be on our Facebook page after this as well. So have a great afternoon, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.